Okay, okay. And he's here, so we'll begin in a second. Okay. You're welcome.
I see. Okay, that's the same thing I just told Kimberly. Right.
I'll go for it again, but I was hoping that, including close solution.
See better in my glasses than my contacts, but the glasses glare.
How are you? Oh, absolutely.
No, it's free. It's free. Yeah, I've always wanted to do that.
Right, I was thinking the same
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We're going to get started as students and other guests continue to file in, but we welcome you to the 2024 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X Black History Month Convocation. We appreciate very much your attendance today and promise that it will be a wonderful event for all of us. My name is Pace McConkey. I am director of the Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights in Education here on campus. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Simone Barrett, who is right here. She has printed programs if you want one for this event to please take with you. Just in a nutshell, the Robert M. Bell Center is established on campus primarily to identify and address any continuing policy or practice in education at any level, elementary, secondary, higher education, including especially HBCU equity issues, any policy or practice that fosters discrimination on the basis of race or which perpetuates the inequities of segregation by race. And then through research, teaching, training, and advocacy, we seek the elimination of those policies and practices. And I will just say that because you cannot address education inequities in isolation of everything else that's happening in our communities and in society, then we are a racial justice center that focuses on other civil rights and racial justice issues, whether it be labor, employment, the economy, poverty, housing, voting, criminal justice reform, civil justice reform, environmental justice. It's all linked together. And so I just wanted to give you that brief description of who we are at the center. Now, just some preliminary words about today's convocation and what is to come. Calendar year 2024 marks the 60th anniversary of the landmark legislation of the Civil Rights Movement and the legislative fulfillment of decades of education, agitation, protest, advocacy, strategic planning, litigation, and unmeasured sacrifice for the cause of racial justice, civil rights, and human rights in the United States and throughout the world. Enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a watershed moment in its own right, leading to other legislative and judicial breakthroughs for civil and human rights, including, among others, which our speaker will likely address, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Housing Rights Act of 1968, and numerous other laws enacted or otherwise adjudicated to protect the rights of persons regardless of race or color, and other protected classes now enumerated by statute. So, here at Morgan State University, the accomplishment of enacting this legislation and the subsequent impact of the legislation over the next 60 years should be taught, discussed, researched, analyzed, assessed, celebrated, and commemorated during this anniversary year. New and continuing challenges and threats to these landmark civil and human rights gains should also be identified and confronted during this anniversary year in an effort to preserve these fundamental protections and to expand them in the never-ending cause of racial justice, social justice, civil rights, and human rights. So, the Civil Rights Act of 1964's 60th anniversary commemoration officially begins today with this convocation in which you are a part. It is proceeding under the sponsorship and auspices of the James H. Gilliam Jr. College of Liberal Arts, and it will proceed throughout this calendar year, so that's both this semester and the coming fall semester of 2024. It will proceed as a series of diverse events, activities, and collaborations that will invite students, faculty, staff, divisions, departments, the entirety of the university community to plan and participate in the commemoration in a manner that is most suitable to each and consistent with already established goals, purposes, and objectives. This will be a substantive, creative, scholarly, social, intellectual, and comprehensive commemoration. So for purposes of coordination, planning, and oversight, Dr. Nbara Ngom, Dean of the James H. Gilliam Jr. College of Liberal Arts, has designated Dr. Iris Barnes, who is the Associate Director and Curator of the Lillie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum, and myself as Director of the Robert M. Bell Center for Civil Rights in Education as co-chairs of the anniversary commemoration, working with a representative committee to implement and oversee the commemoration generally as follows. The commemoration will be a focal point of the university's Convocation series, starting with today's convocation. There will be a substantive, scholarly, civil, and human rights symposium sponsored by the Bell Center and the Lillie Carroll Jackson Museum later this spring. It will focus on the history, advocacy, and events leading up to the enactment of the Civil Rights Act, the impact of the act, and the progressive civil and human rights accomplishments that resulted, the contemporary challenges and threats to the Act, and strategies and actions necessary to preserve and expand these fundamental civil and human rights protections. There will also be student-led celebrations and a conference that will likely happen in the fall semester of 2024, as will a writers' forum with distinguished scholars who have published on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, including scholars from our own faculty. And in the classroom throughout these semesters, leadership and faculty in the various divisions and departments of the university will consider how to appropriately and meaningfully incorporate the commemoration of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into their curriculum and their teaching. I think I should also announce that Governor Wes Moore has declared 2024 as the year of civil rights in Maryland. In large measure, this declaration recognizes the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and we will collaborate with the state as partners in any activities that they would like to collaborate with Morgan State University on. So thank you for letting me give those preliminary remarks about the commemoration this year and the significance and importance of today's convocation. Now, Dr. Iris Barnes is here, and she would have me announce to you that we are excited for your support in voting for USA Today's Best Free Museum in the Nation contest, should I call it? And all of us can vote. And in fact, we can vote every day. And in the back, Dr. Barrett has a handout that looks like this with a QR code, which allows you to vote for the Lily Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum as the best free museum in the nation. Now, you know, there are a handful of those, including some Smithsonian's, so the competition is stiff, but we invite you to participate in that as well. Thank you so much. With that, we welcome you. We invite Araya Nuland to come forward and sing for us as our guest soloist, Lift Every Voice. We'll ask you to stand for that, please. After which, we invite Dr. Mbari Ngom, Dean of the James H. Gilliam Jr. College of Liberal Arts, to offer greetings.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, welcome to this convocation, the first event of our commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. But before I just begin my brief remarks, I would like, I'm here to bring greetings on behalf of President David Wilson, and also on behalf of our Provost and Senior Vice President, Dr. Hong Tao Yu. All of them are just had a prior commitment. That's why they are unable to be here to accompany us on this important event. But I just would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude beyond measure to Mr. Damon T. Hewitt for the privilege and honor just to have you here on our national treasure at Morgan State University. And on behalf of the faculty, student, and staff of the College of Liberal Arts, we just say thank you. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Barry Ngom, the Dean of the James H. Gilliam Jr. College of Liberal Arts. And we call ourselves the academic centerpiece of the university. Why? Because we touch every single student academic life here on this campus. You know, they all take courses in the College of Liberal Arts. So I just in closing, I just would like to thank the co-chair of the committee, Mr. Pace McConkey and Dr. Aris Barnes, and also the committee members. Some of them are here among us for just organizing this important event that's gonna run, along throughout the academic year. And I just would like to encourage you to be part of it because it's your event and you are at the core of it and you should really contribute to it and be part of history, right? And so I not only as student in the classes that some of our colleagues are teaching, but also bring your friends, right? Bring your friends and family members so that they can just be part of this celebration rather. And I also just take this opportunity to kind of plug in for Dr. Barnes. How many of you know where the Lily Carroll Jackson Museum is? Okay. Very few. We have colleagues rather who know. And so I strongly encourage you, student, to go and visit that museum. It's in West Baltimore. Dr. Barnes will talk about it. It's what I call, along with our James C. Lewis Museum, the jewel of the Republic. You know, you need to go and visit the Lily Carroll Jackson and also the James C. Lewis Museum of Art. In closing, just to say thank you very much for to all of you for your presence. And again, Mr. Hewitt, just know that it's a great pleasure, it's a great honor and a privilege to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Dean Ngam, for your greetings and also for your much appreciated leadership here on campus. And thank you, Aurelia, for your beautiful and spirit-filled rendition of Lift Every Voice. We appreciate that very, very much. So as we contemplate hearing from Damon Hewitt, let me just say that if you can let your minds revert to 1963, it was the heat of the civil rights movement that you have studied and understand. So much was happening on our campuses, in our communities. Incredible activism by dedicated civil rights advocates and activists. The year of the March on Washington, led by several civil rights organizations and groups, and Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, and the great strategic work of Bayard Rustin. So 1963, much of America were also in their living rooms watching their black and white TV sets, seeing the civil rights struggle unfold in their living rooms to a certain extent, watching the Bull Connors of the world at work with their fire hoses and dogs and police with their billy clubs. And as I understand it, Damon will correct me if I'm wrong. John F. Kennedy was president, and his little brother Bobby was the attorney general. And as all of this was unfolding in front of their eyes as well, Bobby Kennedy asked the rhetorical question, where are all the lawyers to represent these victims of discrimination on the basis of race and violence? At the time, there were probably a handful of lawyers involved, maybe some in the Justice Department, maybe some at the NAACP. But the question was, where are all the lawyers? And so President Kennedy called a meeting in the White House in June of 1963 and invited 2 members of the bar from each state to come to that meeting. And they met in the White House, 100-some lawyers, and the president challenged them to organize themselves to provide legal representation to the victims of race discrimination and to do it pro bono, without pay. And then was born what is known as the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, which still has tremendous impact today. And Damon T. Hewitt is the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. He has himself decades of civil rights litigation and policy experience, including prior leadership roles in the nonprofit, philanthropic, and public sectors. And formerly as executive vice president of the Lawyers Committee, he coordinated the organization's strategic, programmatic, and operational efforts to advance the fight for racial justice. He was also the inaugural executive director of the Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, a senior advisor at the Open Society Foundations, director of the New York Task Force on Police Shootings. But I think most significantly, to me at least, because this is when I met and began to know Damon, when I was a lawyer with the NAACP at their national office here in Baltimore, and later as a litigating attorney with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. Damon was a young and rising and very distinguished attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he made a tremendous impact, ultimately leading the organization's education practice group and pioneering its efforts to address the school to prison pipeline, among many other things. So I first knew Damon Hewitt when he was a lawyer with LDF. And like many, was amazed at his skill, his dynamic personality, which drew us to him, and his incredible civil rights advocacy and leadership, which you'll experience today as we listen to him and also have the opportunity to interact with him with questions and answers. So it is a great privilege and honor for us to have Damon T. Hewitt here with us today as the leader of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. And let me just remind you that when a coalition of HBCU students, faculty, alumni, and supporters of Maryland's 4 HBCUs decided that it was overdue and necessary to file a lawsuit against the state of Maryland to finally bring Maryland into compliance with federal civil rights laws, to finally dismantle completely its former de jure segregated system of higher education. That coalition went to the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, who took that case and litigated it for 17 years with one of the cooperating law firms, Kirkland and Ellis, Mike Jones leading the way, with John Greenbaum at the Lawyers Committee. This is the organization that took the HBCU equity case to court in Maryland, where the court determined after litigation that the state of Maryland continues to maintain and perpetuate a separate and unequal system of higher education that is segregated by race and which violates the rights of students who attend the state's 4 HBCUs, and that a remedy is required. And ultimately, that remedy was ordered by the court. It was funded by the Maryland legislature in the amount of almost $580 million to bring new high demand academic programs to Morgan, to Coppin, to Bowie, to UMES, and to assure that those programs remain unique to the HBCUs and are not duplicated elsewhere. The impact of the Lawyers Committee is immediately being felt upon you and upon me and all of us affiliated with Maryland's 4 HBCUs. Let's give a warm welcome to Damon T. Hewitt.
You are too generous, brother. Too generous. Can you hear me okay? All right. Good morning, Morgan State. Good morning. All right. Wanted to thank Pace McConkey, my friend. He knew me when I was pilling around as a baby lawyer, and now I'm still figuring out this thing we call civil rights, and look up to people like you all the time. Want to recognize Ms. Newland, just beautiful. Whenever I hear the song, I feel inspired. I was at a breakfast early this morning with our 3 black senators. I'm not going to count beyond 3. With Raphael Warnock, with LaFonza Butler, who's the who came into office appointed in California, and also Cory Booker. And we heard Lift Every Voice sung then as well, and I was inspired. When you sang it, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck raise. You put a special touch on it, so thank you so much. Appreciate you. I want to recognize Dr. Barrett, Dr. Barnes, Dr. Ingam, and the Robert M. Bell Center under Pace's leadership. What you've built here, what you sustain here, what you do here on campus and what extends beyond campus matters greatly. Pace mentioned the litigation on HBCUs, and I was thinking about the connections over time between Morgan State and the Lawyers Committee, and I found in our records, I have here, you can't see it up here, but I'll show it to you, Pace, the cover of the Morgan Global Journalism Review from a decade ago. There's an article by my predecessor, Barbara Arnwine, of the Lawyers Committee, who wrote a piece about 50 years since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and how we had to keep pressing forward. She may as well have written that piece today. She may as well have. And that piece is available, I think, in the archives online, and the entire volume, in fact. So I want to talk a bit today about the history of the Voting Rights Act, but also talk about the contemporary relevance, the relevance to you today, and also tell you a bit more about the Lawyers Committee along the way. But first, I wanted to invite you to do this. I want you to think about a point in time when the following things happened. When elected officials obstructed justice and tried to block civil rights laws or just democracy from thriving and being enforced. A time when a president of the United States had to deliver a televised address pleading with Congress to pass necessary voting rights legislation because what was happening to black people primarily and other people of color in the States. A time when black people were targeted for hate and violence by white vigilantes and white supremacists. A time when racial justice leaders and advocates had to risk their own lives and liberty because they were being targeted and surveilled by law enforcement and others. And a time when hundreds of thousands or more had to take to the streets in peaceful protest for racial justice. When was that? Anybody want to shout out?
Now.
Exactly. What do you say?
Well, now, but I was thinking of the
steps in 1963,
Right.
particularly when Lyndon Johnson said, "We shall overcome." In a
Yes.
message to Congress
Yes.
that brought Martin Luther King to tears.
That's right.
Finally, he's getting it.
You are both correct. You both get the gold star. As much as things have changed, and we have made progress, and we'll talk about that a bit, there's so many things that remain, if not the same, strikingly familiar. The ordinary pain of Black folk, the consistency of struggle and effort that we must undertake and must endure. That hasn't changed all these years. These things could apply to 1963 when Medgar Evers was assassinated, when George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door. It could apply to the last few years when former President Trump, we believe, obstructed justice and more. And there's a case being argued in the Supreme Court right now, and we filed a brief in that case because at the Lawyers Committee, we filed a civil rights lawsuit on behalf, believe it or not, we do police accountability work, but we filed a civil rights suit on behalf of Capitol police officers who were on the front lines that day. Because most of our clients are Black men. And they were not only physically assaulted, they were called all kinds of anything but a child of God, racial epithets, N-word, what have you, while they were just trying to do their jobs. They faced civil rights violations to defend not just life and property, but democracy itself. So that's why we filed a brief, not to be political in an electoral sense, a partisan sense, but because nobody, former president or not, should be able to hide behind the First Amendment as if it's greater than the 14th. There's no such thing as the 14th Amendment. It didn't come after the 14th. You can't say his First Amendment rights are greater than the rights of people not to face and suffer discrimination or insurrection or overthrowing our democracy. So that's why we filed a brief in that case, as nonpartisan as we are at the Lawyers Committee. But you're both right. These things could apply to 63, to 73, 83, 93, 64 when the act was adopted, and today. It could apply at almost any point in time because the history of our work is that there's steps forward. But if you're a student of critical race theory, as I am, proudly, was a research assistant to Lionel Guinier, learned how to teach the curriculum from Derek Bell himself. If you're a student of critical race theory, you know that there are cycles of reform and retrenchment. As soon as you think you've made it, guess what happens? It changes. You get Obama elected, you think, oh, progress. Yes, it was. Then they say it's a post-racial society. You don't need any of this anymore. There are people out there saying, well, racism isn't that bad anymore, or that I don't see race. Somebody said to me, Damon, I don't see race. I voted for Obama. Now think about the irony of that. You're saying, I voted for a Black man to tell me you don't see race. Of course you see race. Because if you don't see race, you don't see me. If you don't see race, you don't value me and for who I am and all of my glory and beauty and complexity and challenge and aspiration. You don't understand who I am. So the long arc of the civil rights movement, as they call it, is very long. I'll tell you some of the facts you already know. I fly through them because I think you've studied these. I'm sure you have. Or you've learned about them. You soaked them in from reading or from watching documentaries or talking to people who lived through it. About George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door, and later that same day, in the wee hours of the morning, Medgar Evers being assassinated, really within hours, and how the Lawyers Committee was founded in the heat of the civil rights movement. It's the steel that was forged in those fires. But we should also remember the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, SNCC being founded around the same time. Those struggles to desegregate schools almost a decade after Brown versus Board of Education. There was massive resistance. The Freedom Rides, 61. The Albany, Georgia movement in 61. The March on Washington, as Pace mentioned, in 63. All of that struggle to get rights on paper. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was not easy. Now, with the Lawyers Committee, when we were founded, it was a really interesting thing. Some people thought of it as, well, some lawyers are going to do some charity work. They're going to help colored folk. But I like to think of the founding of the Lawyers Committee as essentially a really big political project of massive dimension in at least a couple of ways. Pace mentioned that Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General, the president's brother, JFK's brother. But calling these lawyers in was really testing the whole idea that you could have what we call private attorneys general, people who don't work for government, but work in the private bar to be marshal in service of civil rights and racial justice. I think we've been doing that very well. Not just our organization, but many others, but the Lawyers Committee in particular, we work with law firms and we get them into the fight, we get them into the cause. In the last decade alone, we have leveraged 1 million hours of attorney time from those firms. In the last 2 decades, if you adjust for inflation, the value of what they would charge hourly if they charge our clients would be $1 billion of valuation. So we've been doing that part pretty well, we believe. And there's more to do. But the other part of political project actually is kind of embodied by the friendship between me and Pace. You see, that group was not just people who looked like me, or us. That was a racially integrated group, which was notable for the time. There were 244 lawyers in that room. Most of them were actually white lawyers, mostly white men. There were about 40 or so black lawyers. So it was a racially integrated group. Now we're a very multiracial group. I have, Indian attorneys and staff, Latinx attorneys and staff, people across, across racial ethnic divides. But what binds us, just like Pace and I have been bounded, is that we're centering our work in the lived experience of Black people. We're not saying I'm here just for my kind. We're very clear that we're focused on the lived experience of Black people. So the political project is, how can the struggle for civil rights not just be on the backs of Black folks? How can we have authentic allyship, sweat equity, even when it's hard, working at the NAACP pace, working at the Lawyers Committee pace, right? That's what makes our organization, I believe, so unique, that we're such a diverse, multiracial group centered on Black experience. We're not the only group like that, but that's who we are. So our contemporary mission at the Lawyers Committee is to ensure that we fight inside and outside the courts, litigation and otherwise, but we fight to ensure that Black people have the voice, the opportunity, and the power to make the promises of democracy real, to make the words on that paper that people fought for and sweated for and died for, to make the promise of democracy real. And democracy doesn't just mean voting rights. I mean this entire political project we call this Republic of the United States of America, to make that real for us so that we can enjoy not just the fruits of our own labor, but that of our ancestors, that we can transfer something to our kids and our grandkids and our greats, whether it be wealth of dollars, whether it be wealth of culture, whether it be wealth of health, that we actually achieve and realize the abundance of this nation. That is our political project at the Lawyers Committee: voice, opportunity, and power for Black people. Now, a little bit about me, my story and why I do this work. I grew up in New Orleans, in a city in the state of Louisiana that is a virtual gumbo of good, bad, ugly, sacred, and profane, all next to each other. We're close to Mardi Gras Day, so that's sacred and profane right next to each other, right? And so, I also, interestingly enough, my parents finished college but attended schools that were either legally or de facto segregated their entire lives, from elementary school to middle school to high school. And they both are proud graduates of Southern University in Baton Rouge, in that campus. And so I actually, don't throw tomatoes at me, I attended the PWI across town, LSU. Now, I did attend as many classes at Southern as I could because we could cross-register. But I was at LSU, and that's an interesting place because that's the place that gives you alumni like Shaquille O'Neal, the athlete, and Donna Brazile, the political strategist, but also David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard. So I came into my consciousness in being leading the NAACP unit branch on that LSU campus amidst all of that toxicity, alongside all of that beauty, alongside all of that power, that my goal was that when black students walk across campus, not only do we recognize each other, but we stand straight and tall, that we are stakeholders in this institution because the institution owes us. One of the ways that the debts of the past were paid is a program I participated in at LSU called the Nubian Pre-Doctoral Academy, led by a guy named Kofi Lomate, who went on to lead Southern University years later and is a leader in education, led Fort Valley State as president for a while, a very notable scholar and education policy leader. And that program was an outgrowth of a lawsuit similar to the lawsuit about the HBCUs here in Maryland, because the state of Louisiana, like most southern states, not only said you can't go to our schools, you have to have your own school, but they systemically kneecap our institutions. And as I read the headlines, Pace, I see there's talk that that's still happening with duplication of programs. That is still happening. They kneecap our institutions. And so the Nubian Pre-Doctoral Academy was designed to create a pipeline of all black students to get into PhD work. Now, I chose JD, not PhD. There's a little few too many years for me, I think. But the point was that the pipeline was made available to me to pay the debt, to pay for the sins of that past and now we say ongoing discrimination. At the lawyers committee, we're trying to do our part too. Pace mentioned Michael Jones, who was the first black partner at the law firm Kirkland and Ellis. He just retired last week, and he's still on our board. He's going to hang on the board for a while, thankfully, and we'll be at his office for a strategy session next Friday, in fact. But Mike decided, he told the firm, look, we achieved a settlement of over $500 million for Maryland's 4 HBCUs. I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but I'm going to say it. That's a lot of money, but it's also just a down payment on what you deserve, on what you would do, right? So we have to figure out how can we be a force multiplier for good and justice? How do we just not just take that money and think we've arrived and we're done, right? That means continued advocacy, but it also means something else that Mike had the foresight to do. He said, look, attorneys win cases, attorneys get fees. But because his firm was doing it pro bono, he donated his fees. I think some came here, I hope. I know he sent some to Diller, his alma mater in my hometown, with my aunts, and two of my aunts went to school and cousins. He left, skipped Xavier. I don't know why he skipped Xavier. He loved Xavier. But when my sister went to school, my other cousins, I grew up about a mile from Xavier. I could walk to Xavier from my house in New Orleans. But he also gave some money to the lawyers committee, but with the restriction that we have to use that money to create a Kirkland Fellows program to promote the students at the nation's 6 HBCU law schools and students at HBCU undergraduate institutions like Morgan State to get into civil rights litigation work. So I'll be pleased to share information with you, Pace, about the Kirkland Fellows program. It's not a full ride through school. We can't do that. But it is a paid internship and a connection to the work that we do throughout the year and unique experiences that you might not be able to get otherwise. So if you're interested in his work, please follow up with Pace as we get him the information about the Kirkland Fellows program. So I got into this work through my experiences because I had a pipeline like that through that Nubian Pre-Doctoral Academy. I got into this work because I believe that people say, oh, you're a smart one and you made it and this, that, and the other. But I know there's a very, very thin line, if there's a line at all, between me and the brothers and sisters who did not have the same opportunities that I had. I fight to make sure that I should not be viewed as an anomaly and that I'm not in fact an anomaly for any success that I've had. Because I think that is intrinsically within all of us in terms of human possibility and potential. So I will talk about the Civil Rights Act, I promise. But I will give you this frame though as we get into that piece of it in the time we have. Think about this. As long as we have had schools in this country, we have had racial discrimination in education somewhere in this country every single day. As long as we have had elections in this country, we have racial discrimination in voting somewhere every single election cycle. And this one, it's not funny, but it's pretty obvious. As long as we've had police in this country, and it's obvious because policing was created to police us. We have had racial discrimination in the administration of law enforcement. All the institutions with whom we interact every day, not just as black people, just as residents, citizens or not. These institutions have discriminated against us all the time. Now, I'm not saying that as an excuse for what we can and cannot do. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying is the big picture is that is not just the history, that's the beginning, that's the middle of today. And unless we fight and change it, that's going to be the future too. Derek Bell, the critical race theorist, father of critical race theory, said that we have to understand that racism may not be a blip on the screen. It may, in fact, be a permanent fixture on the American landscape, if not global. And so what do? Do we give up? No. Do we just cry foul and don't push? No. We have to fight. But he introduced what he called a racial realism. The translation is act like you know. If you know these institutions weren't built with us in mind, don't be shocked when you're on the business end of a problem. If you know these institutions are not built with us in mind, they discriminate against us, not all the time, but quite often, then isn't it our duty to fight and do something about it and say something about it? If we know these institutions are producing results, don't accept or expect those results. Push against the grain. That is the ordinary pain, but also the burden and the responsibility of us who are on the primary business end of this discrimination. So that's the frame. That's the frame of how we got to where we are today. You know that we had what you call the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, abolishing slavery except for certain felony convictions, requiring your protection under the laws, a long fight, and also not guaranteeing the right to vote, because there is no right to vote under the Constitution, in case you didn't know that. There is a right, however, to not be discriminated against in voting. And that's what the 15th Amendment starts and what other legislation like the Voting Rights Act makes clear, even though that's under attack too. Now, after the Reconstruction, for decades, the nation did not pass a single civil rights law at the federal level. For decades. After Reconstruction ended, KKK grew, citizens councils, white councils grew, all of that stuff happened. So in 1957, though, there was a new law. It established the Civil Rights Act of 57 to establish the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which is led by my very good friend and predecessor as president of the Lawyers Committee, Kristen Clark. That law was followed by another Civil Rights Act in 1960 that was focused a little bit more on voting. But around that time, the late 50s and 1960, early 61, that's all the fires, right? And up to 63 that Pace spoke about. And when JFK came into office, like we hail him as a hero, there was a time when every black household in the country had a picture of JFK and MLK and Jesus, right? And so I'm not here to demean JFK at all. He is a giant and a hero to us at the Lawyers Committee as well. But the point is, he delayed supporting new anti-discrimination litigation. He had to be pushed by A. Philip Randolph and others who coordinated the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin. He had to be pushed. And so, of course, he was taken from us too before he could see that through. So enter President Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. So I don't know if people saw it coming at the time, but as the brother said earlier, LBJ he put something on the line. He used his personal and political capital to push through federal civil rights legislation. I'm going to quote him. He said, "We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law." You know about the filibuster in the Senate, the reason why we don't have the John Lewis Voter Rights Advancement Act to fix what the Supreme Court has done in gutting the Voter Rights Act. That's the reason we don't have a George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Filibuster used to mean a senator stands and talks for 24 hours or more. Now they just sit back. They do it on paper, basically now, or do it just by implicit threat. But when the Civil Rights Act of 64 was introduced, the Senate debated the bill for 60 days, including several weekends. These Southern senators were saying they were going to block everything. And so the instinct was, well, let's water it down a little bit and see if we can get some compromise. But to his credit, LBJ said no, because he knew that compromise would have been the death knell of the legislation. It would have watered it down into oblivion. And so by hook or by crook, his strategy worked. We got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed into law on July 2nd. In July 2nd. So when you think about Juneteenth, between then and the 4th of July, now both American holidays, which essentially are on equal plane. In between that, what happened 60 years ago was the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July 2nd. So think about that when you think about that period from mid-June to early July. Now, the Civil Rights Act bans segregation in public accommodations. It means you can't have a whites-only sign, a color-only sign. You don't have to sit in the back of the bus unless you want to. As kids, we always did, because that was our safe place so we could hang out and do whatever we were doing. But you don't have to be forced to be there. My parents, because they were born in the mid 40s, they grew up in de jure legal segregation. It was amoral, but it was completely legal at the time. Before Brown, before the Civil Rights Act, to have segregated buses, segregated everything, definitely segregated schools, and typically inferior because they got kneecapped, even at elementary and middle school levels. But the Civil Rights Act was designed to change all of that people would have a choice. That black folks want to be in the black community, stay in the black community. If you want to attend the HBCU and the proud tradition and the mission that HBCUs have, you attend the HBCU. But the point was that the law should no longer be allowed to tell you what you can and cannot do in terms of your opportunity, your voice, and your power. So the Civil Rights Act has been one of the most transformative bills in this country, yet we still have this thing, as we got the two correct answers from the audience. What happened in 63 and 64 also happened in 2023 and 2024 and every year in between. So we have to keep on pushing. There has been an intentional effort, I believe, and I know in my heart, to kneecap the Civil Rights Act. There was a case in 2001 when actually I first started practicing PACE, well, a year or so after I first started practicing, called Alexander v. Sandoval. Most of you have never heard of that, but it's important because the court used this arcane term, this principle called the private right of action. And so the logic was, well, this law is about anti-discrimination, but the Department of Justice can enforce it because they have a civil rights division. But you as a private citizen, you don't have a private right of action to sue under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination by entities that receive federal funds. There is a right of action that's clear under Title VII, which is employment discrimination. But there was an effort to kneecap and say, well, you can't address discrimination. And the reason why that's important is that under the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, if you prove discrimination, you have to prove that it's intentional. That is racial animus. You need the smoking gun. You can build the case for intent, but the beauty of part of the Civil Rights Act was what we call the disparate impact regulations to implement the act. That it doesn't have to always be intentional. You can just look at things and say, something's not right. I keep applying for these jobs and I'm not getting the opportunity. I keep looking for housing and they always steer me to certain neighborhoods. I keep applying to these schools and I never get in, but I think I'm just as qualified. Something's not right. I call disparate impact they try to make me think I'm crazy type of law. Because when you know something's not right in your heart and it feels unfair, but it's hard to prove that it's intentionally racial discrimination, it just might be disparate impact. And if a darn sure is wrong. But the courts is trying to limit how we can prove disparate impact. Just recently, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, adopted disparate impact regulations for what we call digital discrimination in the service of broadband. Long story short, in certain neighborhoods that predominantly are black and brown neighborhoods, you might get inferior service, telecom service, like Wi-Fi and whatnot, but you may actually be charged more. And the telecom companies say, "Oh, it's because of we couldn't lay the fiber optics, and the city did this, and the county did that." But we're saying, how can you give us less and charge us more? You may not. It may not be intentional racism, but it is a disparate impact. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is sued to challenge that regulation, and we sued right back. And we say, you know what? The law is not actually strong enough. So we're going to duke that out in court. They're intentional efforts to undermine us and to tell us that the things that we know instinctively are wrong, they're trying to make us crazy laws, make us think we're crazy laws. They're trying to actually tell us that really, unless it's intentional and you can prove it, then it's not wrong. We know what's right and we know what's wrong. So I make that point to say that the Civil Rights Act is a beautiful instrument. It's brought us so much. It's brought us so much, but the attacks continue. And so we have to be vigilant. They said that the adoption of the Civil Rights Act, which then begot the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Fair Housing Act of 68, that was what they called a second Reconstruction in this country to fundamentally realter relationships among people. I'm calling for a third Reconstruction. We need a new set of laws, of paradigms, of activism, of strategy to address how discrimination works today, to address how they try to tell us and make us think we're crazy because we may or may not be able to prove intentional discrimination. But they're slick these days, you know that. They don't make it easy to prove. They tell us that expanding opportunity in higher education or workplace through affirmative action or diversity, equity, inclusion, that's reverse discrimination. They're trying to twist everything around on us. So we have to be vigilant. We need a third Reconstruction that has legal paradigms that address structural racism, whether it's intentional or not. We need paradigms that address what's happening today in the digital realm and in the future in tech. We have at the Lawyers Committee what we call a Digital Justice Initiative. That's why we work on the FCC regulations. We're also working on the power of AI. We worked on a case that came out of the 2020 election cycle where these two guys happen to be white guys who were neoconservatives. They hired a black woman as a voice actor. And I'll paraphrase what she said and I'll directly quote her at the end. And she created a series of robocalls that were sent to 85,000 voters. You get those telemarketing type calls even on your cell phone now, right? Because not many people have a house phone anymore. And so you get these calls and the call said, "I'm such and such from whatever place. And did you know that if you vote by mail, that the information will be used by your creditors to collect outstanding debts? Did you know that the information will be used by the police to execute outstanding warrants? And did you know that the CDC will use it to force mandatory vaccinations?" And here's the kicker line at the end: don't give your information to the man by voting by mail. Trying to have a chilling effect on us voting. Trickeration. Back in the day, they would just pass out flyers and post them on boards saying the wrong day to vote or the wrong day to register. Now they're doing it through robocalls. Here's where it connects with artificial intelligence. Just in the New Hampshire primary, just recently, it's documented that there was voice cloning through robocalls. You take the technology of today with what happened just a few years ago in the robocalls case that we litigated and won, and you powered that kind of stuff. You don't just have a black woman as a voice actor being snookered and hired. You have a voice cloning of Oprah Winfrey, Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, telling us not to vote by mail, telling us mis and disinformation. That is the danger we're under, right? So we need contemporary laws that address contemporary challenges. That's what the Lawyers Committee is doing. That's what we're fighting with alongside our other sister organizations to do. That is the battle that we have today. So in closing, I will say this: I'm happy to take questions if we have time, and if you have any, or even your comments. So people ask me sometimes, because it seems intractable. You tell us we made progress. How do we make progress? And what do we do? And so here's an example. Here's a metaphor. So every year at the Lawyers Committee, we go to Selma, Alabama to commemorate the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis and others marched on Bloody Sunday. And so last year we were there and President Biden was there. So we're literally marching right behind Joe Biden. And so it struck me that the bridge is really steep. Anybody been to Selma before? Okay, yeah. So the bridge is really steep. And I realized that you actually can't see what's on the other side of that bridge until you get to the apex. And I thought about what must it have been like for John Lewis and the foot soldiers for justice, they call them, people who marched, some of them very young, some older, when they didn't know what was on the side, but they had to figure that it could be pain or death. And I thought about what does progress mean in a couple ways. I thought, well, at least I know I'm not going to be killed or beaten when I walk on the other side of that bridge. That's progress. It's not enough, but that's some progress. But I also realized the other part of the metaphor. You don't know what's on the other side until you march, until you push, until you get there. So do we have the faith, not in a system or in law, but in ourselves to march and push? And finally, I thought this. John Lewis and those foot soldiers had every reason to think they would die, but also every reason to think they will lose. Remember, this is before there was a Voting Rights Act of 65. You had, other legislation, but you didn't have that Voting Rights Act. They were pushing for that. They had every reason to think they would lose. Today, there are more of us. We have more organizations. Believe it or not, we actually have more money collectively, despite this crazy economy. We have more laws, even though the laws are under attack. Who are we to think we're going to lose? Who are we to not have the same type of moral clarity and courage and get tuitiveness as John Lewis did when he was almost destined to lose? This morning, he must have read my notes because Senator Raphael Warnock said something very similar. But what he said was that the victory was not inevitable. In fact, it was improbable. That might be how we feel right now. That victory is improbable. But that for sure does not mean that we should not fight. I hope you either learned something or were inspired by something, the words I put on your minds and your heart this morning. And I definitely hope that you will continue to be with us in this fight. Appreciate you all. Thank you. Yeah. Whatever you prefer, because maybe others, whatever you prefer. I'm comfortable. Okay, I'll take it.
Let's get loud for Damon Hewitt and appreciation for it. Very timely and thoughtful remarks. Before we formally dismiss with the alma mater, we do have times for questions and comments, and Damon will be as formal or as informal as he wants to be in taking those questions and comments. Dr. Barrett does have a microphone. If you raise your hand, let her come to you so that everyone can hear you. Thank you. You want to stay?
Yeah, sure.
Good morning, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
I also chose the JD, but I haven't given up on the idea of maybe a PhD one of these days.
Great.
I want to make a couple of observations, and then I have a very serious question to ask you. I was born in 1955 in the time of de jure segregation, and I remember as a child the white and colored water fountains in my hometown in Conyers, Georgia. And I remember that when we went to get the Greyhound bus to go to Atlanta, white people had a waiting room, but black people had to stand outside, no matter what the weather. And I remember that workers at lunch, if they wanted to grab a sandwich at Mamie's Cafe, which was near where some of the factories were, they'd have to go to the window or the back door and something would be handed to them. They couldn't go inside to sit down. In 1968, I helped to integrate my high school. And remember, Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. In 1977, I integrated the restroom at a courthouse, a public building, in Dawson, Georgia, while working on a case down there. And some of the older people were told then that they had to have a college degree to register to vote. We had to lead a voting rights campaign down there. In 1984, while writing for the New York Times, I exposed separate waiting rooms in doctor's offices in some parts of rural Georgia. So the fight was, still needed to be ongoing even then and even now more, I think. So it kind of gets to a question I would love for you to address. In this election season, I still hear a lot of young people, even here in Morgan, saying things like, I'm not into politics. Or I've even heard some people, Black young people, say they think we need a change. And so they're thinking about voting for Donald Trump. We need somebody else in office. So there's a missing link in their knowledge of history and also perhaps in their sense of urgency that some of us old people have. When we say democracy is at stake in this election, I have some real sense of what that means, but can you address for a younger audience, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, you raised such a good point. There seems to be such a disconnect, just underscoring the nonpartisan nature of what we do through our voting rights litigation and the election protection work. I was remiss in not mentioning election protection. It's a national coalition of organizations. The centerpiece of it is a voter protection hotline. The number is 866 Our Vote. Don't worry about the numbers. Just remember 866 Our Vote. Let your fingers do the walking on that. You can call that number if you have a question about where do I vote, or they told me I'm not on the list, they turn me away, or you see voter intimidation or problems, right? And so what we do, we don't do GOTV, get out the vote, as campaigns do. What we do, sister, do GOTM, get out the message. And part of the message is about what is at stake. What's at stake is a lot of things I talked about and some I did not. What's at stake is the curriculum in our schools. Well, under the guise of criticizing, attacking critical race theory, they'll tell us we can't teach factual curriculum. We have a lawsuit in Oklahoma on behalf of a group called BERT, the Black Emergency Response Team. Sad that a group of students and parents had to come together to form a Black Emergency Response Team because of crises, racialized crises in schools, but I'm glad they did it. There are major clients in that case where the state of Oklahoma has a bill that teachers are being basically told you can't teach about the Tulsa Race Massacre or the Trail of Tears. It's massacres of Black people and Native people, right? So what's at stake is our ability to actually learn our own history, which is American history. What's at stake is that there are people think about police accountability as being able to push an easy button at the federal level. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. Most of them are local. Most of them have fewer than 75 officers. So if you want to make a change, it's not just what a president or Congress can do, it's also what your local elected officials do. That elect sheriffs who are elected most places and whatnot, that's democracy too, right? So all those institutions I talked about that with whom we interact every day and where we often face problems of discrimination, democracy, having a voice in your own governance actually allows you to have your say. And then you multiply that as a collective of people, Black folks, so you multiply that, add that to people of other races, ethnicities who are of similar conscience. And then you are exercising real civic engagement. And then you're really having to say to try to change the conditions that you don't like or to amplify the things you do like. That's what's at stake.
Um, Good morning. I heard you use the word kneecapped various times. I just wanted to know, like, what did you mean by that exactly?
Oh, kneecap, it's just a, if someone kneecaps you, that means they cut you off at the knees, like you're walking, you're running, and they knock you down. And they hit you at a place on your body where it hurts somebody. I don't know if you ever hit your funny bone or got hurt in the knee. I've had multiple knee surgeries as a former basketball player. I used to be able to dunk before I put on extra weight. I went to LSU right after Shaq. Remember that? After Shaq left. But anyway, but kneecapping basically is like knock you down in a way that your ability to run and make progress is impeded and made almost impossible.
Good afternoon. So I'm Wayne Dawkins, and like my fellow colleague in the School of Global Journalism and Communication, I too was born in 1955, and in New York, New York. I have a question and a request. And Attorney McConkey, I'm the person who's been playing phone tag with you, but that's the request. But first to the question, because we want questions and answers. So, the Civil Rights Act passes in 1964. Attorney Hewitt, can you maybe for our students offer an anecdote or two on how it was actually put into practice?
Ah.
Because there are numerous biographies,
Yeah.
which I read, where the law now had to be tested to see if it would hold. So that's the question. Quickly, the request. I want to talk with Attorney McConkey and the museum director and you too,
Yeah.
because I just want to let you know about well, you probably know, but if we want to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we have to talk about the godfather of civil rights legislation. And I say that with authority because I've written the only full-length biography of Emanuel Seller, the most important congressman of the late 20th century you probably never heard, many people never heard of.
Thank you.
Well,
Well, yeah, it was not smooth sailing. No surprise. A couple of examples. One is that the implementing regulations under federal law interpret the act to prohibit any institution that receives federal funds from discriminating. And so that means that schools that failed to heed the mandate of Brown and other cases, if they kept doing that, there had to be a punishment or a consequence, rather. The consequence the federal government, Department of Education, has used to be old health, education, and welfare. Remember that when it was all one agency a few decades ago. The consequence should have been that you can no longer receive federal funds. Why should taxpayer money go to discrimination? But I remember learning when I worked at NAACP Legal Defense Fund, we had to sue the federal government to actually enforce its own Title VI regulations. I think the case was called Anderson. In a similar vein, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act on employment discrimination, there's a story about how that non-discrimination on gender was put alongside race as kind of a poison pill because Southern senators said they'll never go for that because who wants to give women rights, right? That's the twisted logic. So the first Title VII case to be argued in the Supreme Court was argued by William Bill Robinson, who I just spoke to yesterday, who was a former executive director of the Lawyers Committee and also an alum of LDF, NAACP LDF. So he's civil rights, family, and royalty at the same time. He argued that case was the first Title VII case in Supreme Court. Now it was actually a white woman, Phillips versus Martin Marietta, which among other things they used to make the solid rocket boosters. They had a facility outside New Orleans actually. So he argued that case in the Supreme Court to preserve the principles of Title VII. So there were legal knife fights to get the law implemented.
if I may,
Yes,
if
okay.
I may,
Sure, yeah.
I'll quickly offer a colorful example.
Mhm.
So we live in the Amtrak corridor, Washington, Baltimore, Philly, New York, Boston, etc. 1964, the Act passes. So now we're going to test it. Now, if any of you read the magnificent Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, it's in that book. So if you are black and from the northern cities, and you're riding south, you could get on the train. Then it was the Penn Central Railroad. It wasn't Amtrak yet, but it was the Penn Central. You're coming south, and you can sit anywhere you want. You're black, but when you get to Washington, thank you. When you get to Washington, if you're black, before the law, you had to move to the segregated cars because now you're definitely in the South. Once you cross into Baltimore, you're in the South. But now in Washington, that's the line.
And that's why when I mentioned the Lawyers Committee with black and white lawyers coming together in '63, that's why it was so profound.
So on the ground
That's why it was
level,
so
not
profound.
on the lawyer level, but on the
Yeah,
ground
for
level,
sure.
there's a conductor, a black conductor that's been going back and forth. So he quietly went to some of the black passengers at Washington and he said, well, you know, you're going to be asked to move, but you can stand your ground and say, politely say, I have a ticket. I'm coming from New York or Boston and I don't have to move. But he said, do not tell anyone that I told you that because I don't want to get in trouble. But there's a law now. You don't have to do that. So there were now numerous ways that where you had to now test the law to see if people would follow.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so
Need a mic.
thank you. So I wanted to piggyback on what she said about like people wanting to vote for Donald Trump or whatever, but my issue is that okay, so I remember when you said it's a fine line or a small line or if there is any line between you and the other black people. But when I talk to maybe peers that's black or just, young black people, I feel like they don't care about the history and it affects our society. I feel like because if you don't know your history, it's like how can you really be moving with the purpose and how can you really be making an impact? So my question is, how can you inspire young people to care about the history and want to make an impact because they think it don't matter because it's like no one is pointing it out to them, but I feel like it does matter. And I also want to piggyback on just like how they take certain stuff out of the kids' textbooks, like the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, and just stuff that I feel like really inspire kids at a young age.
Great question. I'll answer it and I also challenge the question a little bit, the premise. So, this is why I think it's important for us to fight against the laws that are allegedly anti-critical race theory, but really anti-truth, right? Because so we can actually learn our own history. Um, it's hard to make people across generations care about something that happened a long time ago because folks are really focused on the now. And here's I'll admit this. I was asked to talk about the Civil Rights Act of '64, and I love talking about it. And every time I prepare for a talk like this, I learn something new because I do a little more tidbits of research and I learn more in this room, right? But if this wasn't Black History Month and that wasn't the call of the question, I probably wouldn't frame it about what happened 60 years ago. I frame it about what's going on right now entirely, right? And there's nothing wrong with learning history. It is important, like you say, because it helps you give you a roadmap. But you know, Thurgood and Marshall had Charles Hamilton Houston to look to, but they didn't have like a whole, decades of those decades of black struggle, no doubt, right? Frederick Douglass, what have you. But my point is that they had to make the history themselves. Fannie Lou Hamer had to make the history for herself. I think that freedom riders, the Little Rock Nine, um, any collective, the Greensboro sit-in young folks, they did what they did not just based on history, but on contemporary struggle. What's at stake right now and for the future? And they had to believe that a future was possible and that all things they want weren't like gifts, they were a future that they deserved. Just like I started talking about how Morgan State deserves and the HBCUs deserve more than $500 million. I think it's really grounding in like knowing the history helps with your strategy. But the reason people get motivated to move and act is not about history. It's about now and it's about future. It's about fear, which is the biggest driver in politics, or it's about hope, which is what Obama sold. I don't mean that in a negative way, but what he sold, right? Remember the Obama Hope. I'm not sure if you were a voting age then, but remember they had the Hope posters for Obama in his first election campaign. So we have to give people a reason that is grounded in their own lived experience, not the lived experience of their grandparents. Yet, failure to heed history leaves you exposed and vulnerable to taking the same wrong paths or not heeding the lessons. So it's kind of a yes and sister, but I think that history alone is not enough to motivate people to go to the polls or to fight. I think it's history plus.
I'm going to add this as we invite our soloist, Araya Newland, to dismiss us with the alma mater. But I'll offer this as well, and you can comment, please, that traditionally there have been 4 pillars of civil rights advocacy and progress: education, agitation, litigation, legislation. And I think that Damon's remarks have helped us understand those 4 pillars. But we acknowledge that we're not all litigators. We're not all legislators. So how do we influence litigation or legislation? Well, education and agitation. We can all educate ourselves and our circles. We can be educators just to be informed and to be engaged and to be aware. But we can also all be agitators in our own ways, the ways that are natural and normal to us, or ways that stretch us to agitate, to protest, or simply just to raise your articulate voices to make a difference, to get people to vote, or to make a change in this country. So maybe you can close with some comments on that, and then we'll invite Araya to come forward.
Well, sometimes my talks, I didn't do it a lot today, at all today, but I talk about hip hop because I'm, born in '75. I'm a child of hip hop culture of the last 50 years. Hip hop just turned 50. And what Pace just said about those 4 components, it makes me think about hip hop culture, the components. If you're a student or if you've lived it, you know that it is the DJ who spins, it's the B-boys and B-girls who do the dancing, it's the graffiti artists who have the visual representation and expression, and it's the MC who rocks the mic. You don't have to be all of those at one time. You can't do all of those. You can't spin and dance and sing and and spray, but you can do something really well to the best of your ability, and you're part of culture, the culture. And if you do it the way Pace said, then you're also part of the movement. So I hope you choose a path that feels right for you.
Thank you, Damon Hewitt.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was just excellent. And we will continue this discussion throughout this semester and into the fall semester as well, using the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a focal point, but not the ending point, because the future is in front of us and there's so much to do. But how grateful we are for Damon Hewitt of the Lawyers Committee to be here with us today. Thank you so very, very much. Can we all stand for the alma mater and thank Araya Newland for coming today to be our soloist.
Fair Morgan, we love thee so tried and so true. Our hearts at thy name throw with pride. We owe thee allegiance, we pledge thee our faith, a faith which shall ever abide. We pledge thee our love, we pledge thee our faith, whatever the future may bring. And thus our devotion, fidelity to, and homage we pay as we sing. Fair Morgan, as onward the years quickly fly, and thou livest in memory sweet, we bring thee our laurels, whatever they be, and lay them with joy at thy feet. We pledge thee our love, we pledge thee our faith, whatever the future may bring. And thus our devotion, fidelity to, and homage we pay as we sing.
Beautiful, Aurea. Thank you so much. And with that, we are dismissed. Thank you for attending today.
Global Journalism and Communication.